Thank you, Jody. And I think we wanted to say we're learning today in honor of your side of
my brother Avrum Live, ben Eliezer David Halevi.
Hey. All right, so we started last week. The goal of this series was to, over the course of, I think, 5 or 6 weeks, cover a different modern Jewish philosopher each week. The idea was they are going to interconnect and speak with each other. This is the second week, but each week will stand on its own. So I think there's 2 or 3 of you who were here last week. I will reference last week, but I won't assume anything. So last week we talked about Maimonides. The context for that, which I gave, and I'll just sort of summarize in 2 or 3 minutes, is I said this was going to be a series on modern Jewish philosophers. Maimonides is not a modern Jewish philosopher. He lived in the late 12th and early 13th century, mostly the late 12th century. But all of Jewish philosophy since Maimonides lives in conversation with him. He is sort of the, if physics is the example I gave last week, and I'm not a scientist at all, but if physics lives in the shadow of Newton, even if in many ways it's moved beyond Newton, you're not, it's sort of in dialogue with, or sort of in that shadow. That's sort of Jewish philosophy. So in many ways, people may have moved past or disagreed with, or sort of evolved very, in many ways since Maimonides. Every Jewish philosopher is writing in conversation with him. So last week we started with Maimonides. This week we're going to talk about Rabbi Eliezer Berkovits. For a bit of context, Eliezer Berkovits was born, I am now forgetting, I should have Wikipedia'd this before, I apologize, but he started his rabbinic career in Germany actually in the 30s. Was a rabbi in Berlin when Hitler came to power. He studied also philosophy. Did his PhD at the University of Berlin. Wrote on David Hume. He escaped Germany, escaped to England before the Holocaust broke out. He was in England during the Blitzkrieg. Went from there, I believe, to Australia, and then ultimately spent much of his life in Chicago, in America, and then moved to Israel at the end of his life. He was if there was a Jewish philosopher or rabbi in the kind of modern Orthodox world that everyone knew about in the 20th century, it was Rabbi Soloveitchik. Joseph Dov Soloveitchik is kind of the most well-known modern Orthodox Jewish philosopher of the 20th century. Eliezer Berkovits would in many ways be sort of a counter, foil, sort of a very different thinker, but lived in parallel, dealt with a lot of the same issues, lived through the Holocaust, lived through a lot, founding the State of Israel, lived through a lot of all the same sort of major events of Jewish history, responded to them, but is a very different thinker. And we'll cover Rabbi Soloveitchik in a later on in this course, or in this sort of series. But Rabbi Soloveitchik is very much a sort of Jewish existentialist, focuses very much on the experience of the Jewish individual. Eliezer Berkovits really focuses on the Jewish collective and the purpose of the Jewish collective. So that's sort of a bit of context.
Like the Park City Jewish collective.
Exactly, yeah. So that's why he's the first modern philosopher we're covering this week. But yeah, so that's sort of just a bit of context. Now we'll jump into his actual thought. So if you look on the source sheet, we'll start at the very beginning. And I want to start by talking about Eliezer Berkovits as God. So I'll give a bit of context again, because what Berkovits is responding to is Maimonides in many ways. What Berkovits is responding to is Maimonides' version of God. Yeah, his God. Who God is to start for Berkovits. So we talked last week about Maimonides, the God of Maimonides. In 2 minutes, we're not going to be able to summarize. But the God of Maimonides is everything you don't hear that God is in typical religion. He is non-interactive with the world. He's basically, the metaphor we gave last week is he is the battery. That's sort of, the battery that powers the world, but that's it. Meaning there's no interaction, there's no dialogue, there's no emotion, you can't attribute, God doesn't love you, God doesn't hate you, God just is a source of the world. And our goal in life, or our goal in religious life for Maimonides, is to come to an intellectual comprehension of God. Again, he takes this from Aristotelian philosophy. We went in the classes on YouTube from last week, we went deep into Maimonides' philosophy. But it's a very, very foreign God with whom you have no real relationship other than trying to intellectually understand God the way you would try to intellectually understand physics and astronomy. You're trying to understand the world. God stands at the source of it as sort of like the underlying matter or energy that powers everything. And so it's in our quest to understand the world, God sort of stands at the base. But it's nothing that you would think about in terms of religion. We talk about an empathetic God, or a God who cares, intervenes with the world, etc. Maimonides then brings all sorts of philosophical arguments for why that's the case. And many of them we still struggle to respond to. So the problem Maimonides left us with is a very, very distant God who we have no real relationship with, and very solid philosophical arguments for why he's right. but he left us then with very little to do in terms of religion, meaning he left religion to be very, very difficult to relate to. And again, I'll share, you can get the link from Jody if you want to sort of have an hour sort of summary of Maimonides' philosophy. But Berkovits, to start now with Berkovits responds to that conception of God. So if we go to the first source, he says, the inescapable truth about Judaism is that it sees God as personal and as involved and acting in history. Revelations, what Jews learned from God, is not just the truth that human beings perceive through their rational ability, but however it may be interpreted, an actual event occurring between God and this human being or this people. So, first things first, he's saying the sort of baseline in Jewish tradition is that God is personal, involved in the world, involved in history. And the way we learn it, and here again, he's responding directly to Maimonides. Judaism is basically a philosophy. We don't learn this through reason. We learn this through a historical experience, meaning what Judaism has to say about God, it learns from Jewish history, from an argument about a revelation that occurred, from an interaction with God in history. That is our source of knowledge. That's where our data comes from. And if we go on the next source, from an essay of his on prayer, he writes, one can live and pray only in the presence of the living personal God of Judaism. We can't pray to a Maimonidean sort of battery that stands that powers the universe. We know about him not by philosophical derivation or by metaphysical insight or intuition. This is also a response, right, saying if you're asking a question, do I believe in God or not believe in God, right? Or what do I think a God is if I believe in a God? He's saying the Jewish approach to answering that question is not philosophical, it's not rational. It's a claim about something that has happened. Now you can argue and debate about what happened, did anything happen, right? But putting that to the side, he's saying the Jewish claim is that our source of knowledge about God is historical. So when you're debating or thinking to yourself, what do I know or not know, is there a God or not a God? It's not. He's saying Judaism doesn't treat this as a rational question, it's not a rational question in terms of like philosophical, try to prove or disprove. If you believe that that certain events have happened, that is where our knowledge of God comes from. We know him because he made himself known to us, right? The claim in the Jewish tradition is that God revealed himself to the Jewish people in a particular moment on Sinai in a very specific way, and then perhaps in more hidden ways or less direct ways over different periods of Jewish history. We know him from historic experience, from his numerous manifestations in the history of Israel. Man may confront God because God has first confronted man and called his creature into confrontation with him. Meaning, if God hadn't entered into this relationship, there'd be nothing to do with religion. We might have all sorts of philosophical questions about, is there an initial being? What's the source of the world? What's the source of why is there existence versus non-existence? What's before the Big Bang? Interesting questions. Nothing to do with religion. There's no calling into a relationship. The source of religion as a relationship is God confronting the creature and saying there's some sort of desire for interaction. The infinite is unapproachable, but the infinite approached man in the history of Judaism, invited man to approach him. Judaism is God's invitation to man to live in the presence of the Almighty. Man may live in his presence because God desires him so to live. Man may seek God's closeness in prayer because God has made... Okay, and that goes into prayer specifically because this is an essay about prayer. But putting this to the side, your starting question then of, am I engaging in Jewish tradition? He's saying, what is Judaism on a baseline level? Judaism is a invitation from God to live in relationship to God, who has revealed certain things about himself to man in Jewish history, and that's the source of our knowledge of God. Right? So if you want to figure out who God is, go and read about Jewish history, or sort of that's your angle. Your angle isn't sort of reading, like for Maimonides, it was read Aristotle, right? Figure out who God is through philosophical contemplation of the basis of being. Very different. This is a historical tradition. That's where we start. He's also speaking, it's important, he's not only speaking in response to Maimonides, the other thing he's speaking in response to is since Immanuel Kant. So Immanuel Kant was an important German philosopher towards the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century. He was influential, he changed modern philosophy in every realm, but one of the important realms he changed philosophy in was in epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge and what is possible to know. Kant more or less proved, became sort of widely accepted, that all sorts of foundational metaphysical questions about is there free will, is there some sort of divine being, etc., are unanswerable. Just our reason isn't able to get there. The way he got there, he basically tried to argue, and this is, again, there's a lot more to read than we can do in 2 minutes, but in a minute or two, he basically said human beings perceive reality through certain through certain concepts and forms. So I'll give an example. Again, I'm not a scientist, but an example from physics, right? If post-relativity, we sort of learned from Einstein that space and time exist on a continuum, whatever that means, right? Space and time don't exist as two separate axes that you can, time flows along and space exists. They exist in a continuum. So before the Big Bang, we used this example last week. Before the Big Bang, if there was no space, time didn't exist. It's not really before, because time is another dimension of space. Again, what that means, I don't know. It doesn't make any sense to me, and I'm not a scientist. Coming back to Kant, what Kant basically said is the way humans interact with the physical world, we take in physical data through the lens of space and time, as being two separate linear way. Everything happens in a physical space, and everything happens along a range of time. It doesn't work for we have these built-in concepts. Think of them as like glasses. We have glasses, so all this outside data comes in, and they get filtered through these lenses of space and time. So it's like you're wearing red-colored glasses. It doesn't mean that what's out there is actually always red, but these are the only tools we have to interpret the world. So putting aside the example, the idea is that humans, when we take in data, we take in information, we have certain built-in concepts that we're using to interpret the data. Kant basically uses that, and again, I don't want to spend more time on this, it's a bit of a sidetrack, but Kant uses that to basically show how the limits of our knowledge and that we can't know ultimate things about, things like free will and things like the existence of God, and that widely gets accepted in philosophy. Berkovits lives in the world. He's a rabbi, and he works as a rabbi, and he has a PhD in philosophy and comes from that training as well. Is now dealing with reality where you cannot prove the existence of God, right? There is no way to argue. No one's going to be able to prove it or disprove it. So what's his source? What's his source saying? Why do I choose to believe in God, or why do I believe in God, and what do I know about God? I know it from the experience of the Jewish people. I don't know it from rational argument. So he's responding both to Maimonides and to that change in philosophy of what's our source of knowledge about God. And most modern philosophers who are writing about religion are living in that world where we basically say, I can't know, I have no way of proving, how do I then make a decision within that framework? If you read religious philosophy in all sorts of traditions from before the 18th century, they'll give you all sorts of proofs from the existence of God. They'll give a proof of a first cause, everything has a cause, there has to be a first one, various proofs. Those basically all got washed away post-Kant, and then we said, what's our source of knowledge? Okay, so that's sort of step one in Berkovits. Who God is, how we know about God and who he is learned from Jewish history, from the revelation on Sinai, from our texts and traditions that have told us how God has interacted with humans and with Jews in particular over time. Okay, so then why doesn't he make it more obvious, right? It's like, why doesn't God just keep doing it? It's like, what's the point of like doing that once or doing that a few times, then sort of disappearing? So we have to kind of figure out, do we buy that story or not, right? So if we go to source 2,
So just to flesh out a bit better, Kant would have said back to him, well, I don't believe those Jewish texts is authentic, so therefore I can't learn from them?
No, so maybe I wasn't clear enough. You can learn something from history, things that have happened. He was saying when I say a rational argument, you can't make an argument you can't make a purely sort of philosophical argument, right, using deductive logic, like a mathematical style argument. Like, okay, everything has to have a cause, so what's the initial cause? It's that, right? So that type of sort of formal logic argument, formal reasoning argument, he did away with. And you'll just have to Kant, and you'll just have to trust me on that.
What would Berkovits have said to Kant? What would Kant have said to Berkovits' argument? We have Jewish history, which is on that linear continuum of time. Right,
so that's a different type of argument. So it's the same. If I came to you, if I walked in here and said, yesterday I spoke to God. And I'm not being facetious, I'm being serious, right? Do you trust me? You might or you might not. It might be proof enough for me, right? Because that's proof from an experience. Proof from an experience isn't, I don't think is adequate, isn't logically deductive that you take if someone believes the experience happened, then fine, they might believe you, but it's an element of trust. So it's not that you can't know something, right? I might say, God spoke to me, I know it, I have 100% certainty. I can't prove to you that he exists using logic. Does that make sense, is that distinction?
My argument is looking at Berkovits and Kant side by side. If they were talking to each other, Berkovits said, well, we have all this Jewish history, and Kant would say, yeah, but you can't prove that, I don't believe your history.
Well, maybe he would. He might say, I believe your history, and Berkovits might convince him. But he would then say, I still can't prove it logically, but I believe your history. It's a separate. He destroyed one type of argument.
Then you can make a stronger argument to prove it.
Yes, if you believe that,
on-
yeah.
on linear
If
timeline.
if you think you can prove that that God revealed himself in time, if you think you can prove that historical event, then that would be a proof. Obviously, then God would exist. Yes, I think proving a historical event is just really hard to do in general.
Kant accepted the historical events, he would have to agree because it's on his linear timeline.
Yeah, if he accepted that, then yes. If he accepted the
The
historical,
only reason he doesn't hold by Berkovits is because Berkovits can't prove that it happened.
right? I mean, I don't know if Kant believed in. I mean, debatable whether Kant believed in God or believed in the Christian tradition. He wasn't a Jew or not, but he might have believed in the Jewish revelation. But it's no longer demonstrable by logic, right? Which is what most religious and Christian Muslim philosophers did for 1,000 years, was try to prove the existence of God. And Kant kind of said, "Stop, doesn't work," right? And then religious philosophers are, okay, now what? But yeah, okay. So now I want to move on to saying, okay, so why, if the method of learning about God is through experience, or for us, we don't necessarily experience him as in an immediate way, is historical experience, why did God make that so difficult, right? And from Berkovits' perspective, why didn't he just keep revealing himself so that we could all just have certainty? So that's source 2. He says, religion does not reduce man to being a puppet of God. It elevates him to his highest dignity by enabling him to acknowledge God in free commitment. The fellowship is initiated by God in the encounter. It is sustained after the encounter in the ever-renewed act of faith by man. To make this possible, God must hide during the encounter to safeguard man's very survival. In history, to protect the spiritual independence of man in making his decision for God. And finally, he must remain rather elusive to the conclusive grasp of reasons, that man may retain his intellectual freedom when inquiring after him. Where there is compulsion, there can be no fellowship. Long and short of it is, if God made it obvious, you wouldn't have a choice. He wants people to choose. That's Berkovits' sort of very simple argument. Is 1, he wants people to choose. 2, it would be overwhelming, is the argument. Is that if the presence of God were to reveal itself in a consistently in every generation, etc., you wouldn't have the choice, and it would be so overwhelming that you'd lose the sense of independence. It's like, again, this is obviously would be, it's not a direct in comparison at all, when you're in the presence of greatness in any field, right? Being in the presence of greatness diminishes your own ability to sort of stand up independently, right? If you're whatever field you're in, you stand in front of an expert, and there's a bit of what's called an expert halo, right? And all of a sudden your willingness to opine, your willingness to sort of say, hey, here's what I think, and dispute starts to sort of narrow because you're in the presence of someone who you think is an expert. The idea is that God would be to the infinite degree, it would sort of take away that human freedom, and the desire, for whatever reason, we'll get there, but the desire or the idea, the concept that Berkovits has, at least of religion, is some sort of fellowship or partnership. For that to exist, there has to be individual freedom and individual sort of degree of self-worth and ability to make decisions and make choices. If God was present, that wouldn't be there. That's the argument. Okay, next he goes to, and the idea here is to get sort of a broad perspective on Berkovits' philosophy, so we're covering a lot of sort of areas. So feel free, I'll try to leave a bit of time at the end, sort of there's questions about specific parts. But okay, so we have a God who we learn about through experience, but then backs off to sort of give us space to enter into a fellowship for some sort of relationship or some sort of responsibility where man has to sort of step up and be a responsible adult in that relationship. To do what? Like, what's the goal? So that's, if we go to source 3, this is from an essay about Eliezer Berkovits, because David Chazoni summarizes this quite well. He says, Berkovits argues Judaism has always understood its central mission to be the creation of an exemplary community, not just exemplary individuals. Such a community dedicates its entire public existence, as well as the efforts of the individuals who live in it, towards a higher divinely guided order. So the goal of the Jewish tradition is to create, and this, for the people who were here sort of in the previous iterations that we did in December, we talked about whether Judaism is a tradition, whether we talked about different thinkers who saw Judaism either as really an individual religious perfection, right? It's a tradition that tries to get you to some sort of spiritual, religious, moral perfection, versus really social, community, politically oriented. It's trying to create some sort of collective. So Berkovits' argument, right, is the goal of the Jewish tradition is to build an exemplary community. By the way, I think that's the easiest read of the Bible, right? If you think the whole story of the Bible, God sort of comes to Abraham, right, skipping the first few chapters, comes to Abraham, says, I want your people to be a source of blessing in the world, picks a family, says, takes them out of Egypt, says, I want you to build a nation, and gives them all sorts of laws that primarily aren't about meditation on some sort of spiritual, lofty, some whatever. They're primarily laws about politics and commerce and agriculture. They're ways of trying to build a just society, right? Like if you read the Bible sort of through, there's parts that are more religious, so to speak, or ritualistic, and there's a lot that's pretty political, economic, social. And the idea is if you're building a society, that it makes sense to encompass all of those components, right? So that's for Berkovits the goal: build an exemplary community. In the biblical view, the life of the Jews as a people is to play a central role in the establishment of human morality. So the idea of building this exemplary society is ultimately it should percolate and have an impact on a more moral and just and good world as a whole. Man's improvement requires a living example. But man, as we find, so if you want to improve the world, you want to make an example. But you can't pick individuals. Man, as we find him, is not a detached individual, but part of a society with its own distinct habits, values, and cultural dynamic. Not the education of holy individuals, but the existence of a holy people constitutes Judaism's central contribution to establishing morality in the world. The argument we'll read a little more sort of in this next source, but the argument is actually quite simple. We want to be effective. We want to create an effective tool for making a better world. Individuals can do so much, but to have impact as a role model on a broader level, you have to act on a bigger level. Very practically, why? Because individuals can't be role models on what it means to run an economy, on what it means to run a military, on what it means to have a political system and a judiciary. Like individuals just don't do that. Societies do that, right? So if you want to produce a model society, you have to act on a broad level. There can be great people, right? But a Mother Teresa might be able to be an example for all sorts of things. She can't be an example for how you build a sort of just economy that takes, that balances all the different components need to be balanced, right? It's just not possible. You need a society for that. And so Judaism has to create a society. If we go to the next source, Judaism is not an idealistic or a spiritual religion, but a human one. It's a religion for the whole of man. It aims at relating life in its entirety to God. It is not, therefore, so much a religion of creed, meaning of beliefs. It's not a religion of dogma. Right? Maimonides was probably the first, maybe the only, but definitely the first to sort of say, hey, here are the things you have to believe to be in or out. Like he set these 13 principles of faith. That's very not Jewish, to set these sort of principles of faith. Judaism traditionally, and I would say still, is very much structured around practice, way of life, building certain types of communities, and those communities might be different. You can argue which ones are more or less authentic, but it's not about creed. It's not about, I believe this, this, and this. Maimonides turned Judaism into a philosophy where you were trying to get to truth. And so it was really important to know, hey, here are the 10, 15 things that are true foundationally about the world, because we're trying to get to truth. Like, know where you're going, then also figure out how you can prove it and, like, understand why it's true, but, like, know 1 + 1 = 2, and then learn the principles of math so you actually understand why 1 + 1 = 2. Berkovits say that that's not what it's about, right? So it's not a religion of creed. It's a religion of deed on earth, of impactful action. The intellect or the soul may be satisfied with the creed. The whole man, however, may serve God only through the deed. In order to be, the deed must be effective in the external world and history. Okay, so Judaism has to have a society if it's going to be it's going to act effectively in the world, right? It has to live as a community, a body politic. Like, it has to be able to be an effective actor and player in the world, which only happens on this communal level. And its goal is to be, hopefully, one that influences the world towards making it better. That's the purpose of the tradition, right? And God steps back, so to speak, to give the Jewish people freedom to try to do that. Because if he was sort of on your back the whole time or revealing himself the whole time, we wouldn't have the freedom to try to do that ourselves, and it would just be meaningless. You might as well set it all up. There's, I think, a very good question that I don't have any good answer to, is to, right, if God could just set it all up and make everything perfect, like, why? It seems like a bit of a game, right? It's like it's like you put a toddler at the front of a puzzle and get them to walk through, get them to walk through the maze. Why? I don't know. You're trying to train their skills for something. But so, like, is the whole world just that? Like, is this sort of a game where, like, God puts, like, humans and I want you to try to make it better, and if we screw up, really, really bad things happen, a lot of suffering happens. Like, why? I don't know, right? Like, I don't have an answer to that. And we'll talk a little bit we'll get into that a little more seriously at the end. He writes a lot about the Holocaust and theology post-Holocaust. But what the purpose of that is, he doesn't give an answer. He's describing it. Okay, so if that's the goal, now he gets a little bit more into detail on two aspects. One on Jewish law or halakha, which is sort of Jewish law in Hebrew, and how it works to achieve this goal. And the second part is on Zionism and the idea of a Jewish state and its role in achieving this goal. So if we start in section 4 on Jewish law, first source from a book called Not in Heaven, the rabbis in the Talmud were guided by the insight, God forbid there should be anything in the application of the Torah to actual life situation that's contrary to the principles of ethics. What are those principles? They're Torah principles like you shall do that which is right and good in the eyes of the eternal, or ways of pleasantness, or paths or peace. Without getting into all sorts of details about what is and isn't moral and all sorts of specific arguments, his basic vision is Jewish law cannot conflict with morality. If the goal is to build a just world, the law can't go against morality. If it does, we have a problem, meaning we're misunderstanding something. We either need to reread the law, maybe more traditional parts of the Jewish world might say you have to reread your sense of morality. Your morality is skewed. More progressive parts of the Jewish world may say we have to sort of be more aggressive in the way we reread Jewish law. But these can't be at loggerheads. It's not permitted. It doesn't make sense. The whole goal is to move. Is to make the world a better place, to build a more just, a better society. And then the next source is a little more interesting in terms of some of the details of how does ritual work. So he talks also about ritual in terms of the relationship with God as sort of being important as a motivating factor in moving towards this goal. But he talks also about ritual a lot as a form of training for the ethical. So since the days of, if we look at source 4b, and this is again from another essay from David Chazoni about Eliezer Berkovits. He writes, since the days of antiquity, Berkovits writes, Western civilization has mistakenly believed it's possible to convince the body by reasoning with it. And so it hoped in vain for effective ethical conduct through education. We read this source, by the way, in December in a different context, if it sounds familiar. At its best, Western civilization was talking to the mind, never reaching the body. What does that mean? If you start reading moral philosophy, what almost all moral philosophy does is argue about, in fact, sort of secular, unrelated to moral philosophy in the Western philosophical canon. It argues about what's good and what's not good. Really, really interesting arguments. Does it have any impact on actually making someone meaning, are moral philosophers better people than non-moral philosophers, even on their own criteria? His argument is basically moral philosophy the Western civilization as a whole has spent its time trying to argue about what's good. But it doesn't have a mechanism for trying to actually make people good, because you can be, the fact that you can be the most prolific moral philosopher, it's actually not impact. Knowing what's good doesn't necessarily have any impact, or doesn't have sufficient impact to actually motivate or incentivize or manipulate you to act in that way. By focusing exclusively on the training of his reason, and leaving aside the very practical and consequentialistic question of how the body may be trained to follow the commands of the intellect, Western man was never adequately prepared to act decisively in the face of evil. Right? He's saying, and this, he's definitely has the Holocaust here on his mind, but the Western civilization may have spilled endless ink on what is good, but was it effective in training itself to actually do the good when it faced real challenges? The body is not accessible to logical reasoning. One can only teach it by making it do things. One does not learn to swim by reading books on swimming, nor does one become a painter by contemplating the styles of different schools, right? These are really easy and obvious examples, right? You don't learn to ski by reading about skiing. You don't learn to do anything with your body, really, by reading about it. That might help, but there's got to be a whole bunch of other training if it's going to be effective. One learns to swim by swimming, to paint by painting, to act by acting. This applies nowhere more strictly than in the realm of ethical action. Thus, for Berkovits, even the ritual aspects of Jewish law, which are devoid of obvious moral worth, are nonetheless crucial for the moral training they provide. The dietary laws, for example, can be understood as preparation for a situation in which proper moral conduct may come into conflict with a specific physical urge, in this case the appetite for food. Through the continual controlled inhibition of this appetite for the sake of a higher law, man learns to limit the influence of this urge on his actions. If you skip down towards the third last line, the purpose of the inhibitive rules is to practice saying no to self-centered demands, whereas the fulfillment of positive commandments is the exercise of saying yes in consideration of an order different from one's own. The purpose of ritual law here, and we talked about this, I think we talked about this argument a bunch in December.
Purpose or one purpose?
The purpose in this, I don't want to say the only purpose, but this purpose of ritual law is to train you to an order that's heteronymous to yourself, right? As opposed to saying, I'm doing things based on whatever makes sense for me or I want to do right now for whatever considerations I have. If you're living a life that is observant of the Jewish rituals, you're constantly making decisions based on a rule both to actively do something and to refrain from doing something, that's heteronomous. That's outside of yourself. That's about someone else's interest, so to speak. Berkovits saying this is training for the moral situation. The moral situation is right. You enter the moral situation that's challenging. An easy one is when the good thing is also what you just feel like doing. The moral situation that's challenging is you feel like doing something, and there's some external other interest that says no, or you should do something else. Berkovits' argument is if you don't train yourself to sort of constantly live in a way like that, where you're sort of trained to live not like in a way that you have to be an ascetic and self-denial, but that you're constantly responsive to demands that are outside of the self, then you won't be well trained to respond to the moral situation. That's sort of a training. Now, I don't know if this, can you apply this and test this, test what's moral and are people who observe these types of ritual codes more moral or not? I don't know, but as an argument, right, as an argument for the purpose of ritual law, I think it's very interesting and compelling, especially when he's saying the whole point or the major point of the Jewish tradition is to make a better society. All sorts of things that sort of seem like they don't make sense. How are they still productive? Now, it also is an easy answer to give when you say, oh, something doesn't make sense. Well, just do anything that doesn't make sense because it forces you to act in the interest of something else, right? So I think you could apply this logic to doing all sorts of anything that's sort of not in your interest. So I think, like you said, I think it would be helpful to also still have compelling reasons for the specific rules, right? So if we wear tefillin, right, you put the phylacteries on your head and on your arm to pray. I could say put, the cloth from that machine on your head and spin around 30 times in the morning. Anything you make up could, in theory, fit this argument. So I think we'd want to look for compelling ways that our rituals are also symbolic and meaningful inherently, but beyond that as a system, he's saying there's a value in a system where you're constantly responsive to interests outside the self.
In social science experiments, I don't know if it was Milgram or the marshmallow experiment with the toddlers.
Yeah.
Right? Kids who
Delayed gratification.
were able to delay their gratification, they studied these people over long periods of time, and they ended up in higher socioeconomic outcomes.
Right.
Which is consistent with this argument.
Right. I think, I don't know if I distinguish, I think, between delayed gratification and someone else's interest, because delayed gratification is still in your own interest, right? It's saying, I want more, but I'll get more if I'm patient, if I hold off, but it's still about my gratification. By the way, I think I watched that, I think, with my wife and my parents a few months ago. The experiments are very funny to watch, because you see these toddlers sitting in front of the marshmallows and just twiddling their thumbs and licking them and trying not to eat them. Yeah.
Wait until I come back.
You get a second marshmallow, yeah. They're very funny videos. They seem a little torturing, but anyways, okay. Source 5, talk a bit about Zionism. Or not necessarily, Zionism is a sort of a modern movement. Stepping back from Zionism, having a Jewish political society, right? So if we talked about before, if the idea of the Jewish tradition is to build an exemplary society and community, having a political body or an autonomous political body in order to exemplify and figure out how to best run an army, an economy, a judiciary, all these things, obviously is necessary. That's not an argument that every Jew has to live in Israel or not live in Israel, but that the Jewish society has to have as a whole, as a people, we have to also have a political body with some sort of autonomy or sovereignty. Otherwise, you're not acting on that stage that you're meant to be acting on. So if we read here in his source in 5a, he writes, well, by faith alone a soul may be saved. Perhaps the deed's raison d'etre is to be effective in the world. We've talked about this, right? Judaism isn't just about some sort of faith. It's about trying to be effective in the world. For the sake of its effectiveness, the deed will seek for its realization a group that's motivated by common faith. Okay. But what if the fruition of the idea as the deed encompasses the whole of human existence, right? So if the idea that our tradition is trying to manifest is meant to encompass everything in human existence, if the faith seeks realization in economics, morals, politics, and every manifestation of human life, in that case, the group ought to be all comprehensive. Such a group should be mankind, right? So God should have had a religion of mankind, ultimately, if it's going to be sort of, meant to help everyone. But mankind is not a group. It's not a historical entity. Meaning mankind doesn't act, right? Civilizations develop independently, right? The Eastern traditions developed independently, even though there may have been cross-pollination. Civilizations develop independently. We don't act as a collective mankind. Maybe nowadays we do a little more, but definitely, for most of history we didn't. Mankind itself is an ideal. The comprehensive group to be created to suit the comprehensive deed as historical reality is a people in sovereign control of the major areas of its life. The faith of Judaism requires such a comprehensive deed. Basically, the biggest unit that sort of functions as a unit, his argument on mankind, is the nation, as a people, right? And so Judaism needed a people if it wanted to act on the biggest stage of the world, relate to every matter that humans relate to, but still exist as a collective that exists in dialogue, in continuous dialogue with itself and in internal debate with itself. It still had to be small enough to be a collective. The second source, 5b, this understanding of Judaism finds expression throughout Berkovits' writing. In his extensive works on Jewish law, he argues the law must be understood not just as a code for individual piety, right? Jewish law, halacha, is not about how the individual lives his ritualistic life, but as a system which combines the devotional with the political, is addressed to the life of the community no less than that of the individual. The Talmud is not merely an ethical code, but the constitutive document for a living people. The most successful experiment in the history of national constitutions, which alone preserved a whole nation against the continuously stupid and wicked enmity of the entire world. Jewish law resembles far more closely the code of conduct governing a living community than a regimen for piety, right, of some individual. Now, when we talked about this again in December as well, when we talked about separation of church and state and how Judaism or tradition relates to that, right? Berkovits doesn't argue. He was quite liberal in his halachic writing. They call him like a liberal Orthodox sort of Jew, is probably if you had to categorize him. It wasn't that, hey, take the Shulchan Aruch or take sort of a code, sort of a medieval code of Jewish law and apply that as the law of, for example, the state of Israel. That was not his approach at all. But the idea was, if it also wasn't an argument of religion should speak to the individual and the family, and we'll have law, that sort of secular law that speaks to the rest of society. His vision was that if our tradition is supposed to speak to all of society, it has to be able to speak to politics, economics, to other social issues. But if it's going to do that, it has to also do it to the world where it's at. It can't be taking something that just doesn't function, doesn't work for a society that has religious and secular and different types of, very different types of Jews. The tradition has to adapt to speak to that. How that works on each individual case is sort of a separate topic. But for him, it was a critique of Jewish law. It was a critique of much of the Orthodox community that it wasn't willing to push far enough. So he wrote, for example, about conversion. He was very disturbed by the sort of trends of sort of conversion separating into conservative Orthodox reform. This is not exactly about sort of the political side, but saying if the Jewish people are meant to function as a people, one, this is bifurcating, but two, we can't just say, even though he was an Orthodox rabbi, he was saying we can't just say everyone listen to the Orthodox, go to the strictest. We have to find a way as a people where we function together as a people and deal with these sort of legal issues, but they're not purely formally legalistic. They're about building a society together. Yes, sadly not, in my opinion, not very well, because I don't think we have any dialogue or much dialogue on. There was a vision. It's actually very sad, I think. There was a vision at when the state of Israel was sort of getting off its feet among a portion of scholars of Jewish law. They called it the movement called like Mishpat Ivri, which means Jewish law, but it means more like Hebrew law, and Mishpat is usually the word that's used also for secular law. It was basically an attempt to take the Jewish tradition or take the codes of Jewish law, and done by serious scholars of Jewish law and serious rabbis, and try to bring it to speak to contemporary legal issues. So, stuff written about intellectual property law and copyright, and how does our tradition actually speak to the whole corpus of life? The sad part is that the tradition, and it was intended, the goal was to also have an impact, not have an impact to try to take control over the legislative process of the state of Israel, but to be a serious resource for the legislative process and for the judiciary in the state of Israel. The sad part is the movement largely failed, and that it didn't become much. There are in certain legislation around damages law, I think there is some influence of certain areas of Jewish law, but as a whole, the judiciary in Israel will quote areas of Jewish law in certain ways, it's part of the culture, but it's not part of the jurisprudence, if that makes sense. It's these sources are there as part of the culture, which is great, but it isn't. They're not speaking to the materiality of decisions. They're not impacting decisions. They're more like a nice quote to bring as part of the decision to sort of tie it into a Jewish source. So it was a movement that largely failed, but I think it's a movement that Berkovits was really pushing for. And you can blame both sides. I don't know enough of the history. You can blame both sides for that. But so that's his vision really of Jewish life. And now I want to go into one more topic, and then I'll leave a few minutes for questions. But it's the Holocaust, because he wrote a lot about it. I know it's not like a direct sort of segue from what we were talking about exactly, but what we started off with, for Berkovits, was God stepping back. And that segues, and he was deeply impacted. Obviously when he ran away from Germany, he ran away from Germany literally at the last second, lived through the Blitzkrieg. it obviously had a huge impact on him, and he wrote his book called Faith After the Holocaust. The very, very basic argument, and we'll read, it goes into more detail, but the very, very basic argument is free will, right? Is God steps back, gives man responsibility, gives man guidance, but ultimately gives man responsibility for the world, and largely doesn't interfere. Maybe interferes if there's maybe will prevent total destruction of the world, or total destruction of the Jewish people, but largely leaves it to man. And he says, and we'll read a bit from that book now to sort of close off. But he says he portrays this very powerfully. He gives a few examples, and he leaves with also a very powerful question. So an example he gives, he says on Yom Kippur, right, on the Day of Atonement, we talk about God being gracious and having patience and allowing us to screw up and do repentance and get forgiven. And he says, look, when someone does something bad, when God's sitting there being patient, waiting, allowing you to repent and go through your own personal journey, he's allowing you to hurt people, and hurt people badly, right? If a murderer can repent, he's allowing that guy, as he's figuring out his path, to go and do a lot of damage. So there's a flip side of our sort of gracious, patient God has a flip side. Those things come together. So that's sort of one piece says what I think he puts very powerfully, because he puts that sort of, there's two sides of the same coin, right? If I want to be allowed to screw up and then sort of, not get punished and sort of work through it, then I'm allowed to screw up in a way that hurts the person who I'm interacting with. The second part he says, actually, let's read this and then we'll talk about the last part. So this is from his book on the Holocaust. He writes, "The hiding God is present, though man is unaware of him. He is present in his hiddenness. Therefore, God can only hide in this world. But if this world were altogether and radically profane, there would be no place in it for him to hide. He can only hide in history. Since history is man's responsibility, one would in fact expect him to hide, to be silent while man goes about his God-given task." Right? History is this place where, for Berkovits, God has sort of charged man, begged man, asked man to do the good that he's asked to do, but where God sort of hides and waits and sort of tries to get man to do what he's supposed to do, but doesn't interfere. Responsibility requires freedom, but God's convincing presence would undermine the freedom of human decision, right? If every time you tried to hit someone, sort of your hand got slapped away, you'd stop. God hides in human responsibility and human freedom. God, as a rule, cannot intervene whenever man's use of freedom displeases him. It's true if he did so, the perpetration of evil would be rendered impossible, right? God can get rid of evil, he says. There can be no evil. There's a choice that God makes. When something like the Holocaust is happening, I'm not getting rid of it. I'm letting it happen, right? But so would the possibility, right? He could render the evil impossible, but then so would the possibility for good, right? You'd also have no more possibility for good. If God stops man, if he stops evil, he's going to stop good, because if every time you try to do bad, you're stopped from doing it, right? Then the only thing you can do is good. To allow the place for man to step in and freely be great, you have to allow man to freely step in and do really evil things. If he has such, where am I? Okay. If God did not respect man's freedom to choose his course and personal responsibility, not only would the moral good and evil be abolished from the earth, right? We wouldn't have good or evil, but man himself would go with them. Right? Humans as we know them exist in that world of screwing up, hurting, trying to do good. That's the world. That's at least experience. That's what we know, right? So that world would not exist if we didn't have that freedom, or the world as we know it. If he has this freedom, he'll use it. Using it, he will often use it wrongly. There will be suffering for the innocent. The question, therefore, is not why is there undeserved suffering? The question meaning to God, right? If you're challenging God, the question isn't why is there undeserved suffering, but why is there man, right? What you have, the argument is what God made is free human beings. Free human beings do really, really bad things. They do great things and they do really, really bad things. So the question isn't why is there bad. The reason there's bad is because man does bad. That's his argument. Put aside natural disaster, separate question. But let's talk about human-inflicted suffering and evil. The question to God is, why did he make this? Right? Why did he make man with the amount of suffering he can create? He who asks the question about injustice in history really asks, why a world, why creation? To understand this is, of course, far from being an answer to our problem. So he says, right, the fact that the question is, why do we have this freedom? Why do we have the world as we have it? It doesn't get rid of the question. And he quotes, I don't remember if I brought it here, but he quotes a famous passage from the Talmud where they sit in the Beit Midrash and for 2 years they debate whether it was better that God would create the world or not create the world. And ultimately they take a vote, the way the rabbis traditionally sort of made decisions. And the vote came out that it was better not to have created the world. Too much suffering, not worth it. But now that we're here, we've got to do what we can. We've got to be as good as we can. They don't say that. They say it was better that the world would not have been created. God allowed tremendous suffering. The question is that suffering worth it? And arguably the only people who can answer is the suffering worth it are the people who go through the suffering. Now, how do you balance the people who go through the suffering versus people who have great lives and say, no, the world is awesome. Like, I love the world, right? Like, there's a lot of good. This isn't to discount. There's a lot of good, right? I don't know. How do you do a calculus of like of the most joyful moments in the world versus the most horrible suffering? I don't know. I don't have anything to say about that. But that's the argument, is that's the world that was given. The question is, the fact that the rabbis at one point took a vote doesn't mean that's the final answer about if it's worth it or not, right? But his response is God created this type man as we know him, or as this free being. Is that worth it or not? That's the question, right? But to see a problem in its true dimension makes it easier for us to make peace with the circumstances from which it arises, right? She says this doesn't give us an answer, but it allows us to make peace with the circumstances, like to get our head around the circumstances. It's not very profitable to argue with God as to why he created the world. Maybe it is profitable to have that debate. I don't know if that's convincing, but right, he's basically saying, look, it's here, right? It's here, God made it, if you believe God made it, and so that's what you have, right? So if you're asking,
how could we in any form decide that God was wrong?
I mean, I'm lucky I haven't had so much suffering in my life. I can understand someone who's gone through a lot coming to that, like, I don't think it's unreasonable for certain people to come to that conclusion. Right.
Rational, your opinion should be better than.
Right. So I don't know if we tallied up. I don't know how we answer that. But he changes the question, I think, which is very interesting. Right. The question is this human experience and human history as we have it? What? Why? And we go back to what I said before. That's sort of putting the toddler at the front of the puzzle. Like God, if you say like God kind of created the world, said I want this to be good. Please make it good. Here's how you make it good, but also you can make it bad. Like what? And then let's say we succeed, and let's say we bring some sort of messianic era where like everything is great. What was the point of that process? I don't know, right? Why? And that's the question. Why? I mean, why does God create the world? I don't know, right?
Information is only up to this point in time.
Right. So we don't know why, and if it's worth, and if the answer is good enough for us, right? I don't know. He says it's not profitable to have that argument. He obviously decided to take his chance with man. He decided for this world. Given man, God himself could eliminate moral evil and the suffering caused by it only by eliminating man, by recalling the world of man into nothingness, right? He wouldn't have to destroy the world. He'd just get rid of human experience as we know it, right? Because if we were sort of coerced or experienced our lives as coerced, right, as deterministic, and we always did good, like we would still exist, but not as we know ourselves. Yeah. So while God waits for the sinner to turn to him, there's oppression and persecution and violence among men, right? This was the example I gave before, right? Well, God is sort of gracious and patient. People are doing all sorts of really bad things, and God's waiting for them to sort of repent. Yeah, there seems to be no alternative. While God tolerates the sinner, he must abandon the victim, right? If God's allowing the sinner to go through his journey and try to be good, the victim is the one who suffers the consequences of that, the victim of that sinner. So I don't know why I didn't intentionally mean to end with like this sort of somber part on the Holocaust theology, but sort of coming full circle, right? The vision of religion for Berkovits is there's a God who. What do we know about God? What we know about God is through Jewish experience of being tasked with some sort of vision of coming to some sort of messianic era, improving the world through a tradition, through a vision we've been given as a people, as a society, body politic, community, as a society, civilization, right? Whatever you call it. How he understands the importance of Judaism being a politic, a nation, and a religion, a people, a society, and not just a sort of spiritual religion is because of that goal, right? The reason God sort of steps back and we don't see him, so we don't really see God so much, is because man is supposed to step into that void and sort of take charge and work towards that goal. If God stepped into the void, then man would sort of recoil, man would lose his space. And that's the vision of the purpose. Ritual plays into that, right? Our laws about morality and economics play into that. The current Jewish history and politics play into that, right? What the state of Israel is supposed to be, what the role of Jews in the diaspora in that relationship and their impact on the societies they're in, very much as opposed to being sort of a purely tactical question about how do we survive, what do we do, what do we think is the right thing politically, etc., is actually a deep question about the purpose of our people, right? How we're in a pretty, there's a lot of bad, but we're in a really compelling or powerful moment in that history, right? And so for that there's a lot of spotlight on us, maybe a little less than there was a few months ago, but there's still a lot of spotlight on the Jewish people. And that's both the opportunity and the responsibility. What that means in practice is not my place, right, to say, but I think that's sort of the challenge. Taking Berkovits' vision applies a very concrete challenge to what it means and what we're supposed to be doing as Jewish communities today. That's it. We got 5 minutes if there's any